Good morning. Good morning. How are you this morning?
I'm well, and yourself?
Good, good. It's really good to have you. We're excited to have you this morning on the platform. This is going to be an awesome time together. So, we're going to start out with me reading your bio, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
Great, great, great. Dr. Gill is a native of Portland, Oregon, and a clinical and research internist at Crosson University. She is a certified psychologist and therapist with experience in clinical psychology, psychotherapy, 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 All right. All right. Let me pick up where we were at. Her clinical and research interests are specific to identity development, traditional and indigenous practices in healing and exploring mental health of persons of the African diaspora. An advocate, fervent servant, and proponent of justice, Dr. Gill has ultimately dedicated her career to the advancement of marginalized populations, incorporating policy, public health, and a holistic approach in combating significant disparities that disproportionately affects people of color. Welcome, Dr. Gill.
Thank you.
So you and I had an opportunity to chat extensively the other day. It was an awesome conversation. We probably would still be talking if we didn't get disconnected, right?
Yes, yes.
You have so much to offer to the platform this morning. So in addition to this amazing bio, tell us a little bit more about your research, your what you do right now currently.
Okay. So currently I am a addictions counselor at
Mhm.
Pyramid Hillside, part of Pyramid Healthcare, and that's located in East Stroudsburg. A part of my responsibility is identifying clinical goals and objectives that are consistent with co-occurring disorders. We understand obviously that addiction is not autonomous. Typically it's in conjunction with a mental health diagnoses and persistent mental illness that occurs with that particular population. And I
Okay.
also provide outpatient counseling and services to a very similar demographic. At the residential facility, it is all male, which
Okay.
is an added dynamic. There
Yeah.
are unique experiences that are
Yes.
specific to males in particular in reference to addiction. And so that is my primary role as it stands at this time.
Great, great. So, we could go in so many different directions with trauma, with addictions and trauma in Black men. And it's just
Correct.
so much we can jump into, right? And
Yes.
as you and I talked about, I'm a certified trauma therapist and been doing trauma in an area not far from you. So, fellas, guys, all those that are listening, we are natives of, well, we are in Pennsylvania right
Yes.
now. So we're in Pennsylvania. And so we do similar types of work, right? And so today's platform, we're looking at healing of sexual trauma. And so that's a big topic. That's more than 1 hour, right? So let's kind of
Yes.
jump in. I know that you and I talked a little bit about identity and some of the racial discriminations and pressures that we face across the diaspora as people of African Americans and people of color, Africans and African Americans across the diaspora, right? So let's go there first because that was so interesting what you were sharing about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So trauma, of course, like in general, I believe that in my research, how it's been defined is any event or incident that exceeds our ability to effectively cope, meaning
Hmm.
we don't have the necessary internal and also external resources that would allow us to overcome whatever that specific incident or situation is. However,
Right.
for minorities, there's an added element of transgenerational because a lot of our trauma does manifest throughout generations and also from the system itself in terms of the family, the community dynamic. There is societal
That's
implications
right.
that can be explored further in reference to our trauma as well. And then there's
Mhm.
historical trauma. Historical trauma is more so shared amongst all persons based on
Mhm.
what's occurring within a particular moment in time or within our history. And so
Right.
obviously for us, kind of trauma itself stems from slavery and has continued to manifest itself and reverberate throughout time And it affects obviously not only the individual, but our practices, our customs, our traditions. And so, as it stands, the Black community today across the diaspora is significantly being affected 400 plus odd years later, still, the remnants of slavery.
That is amazing. I think that's amazing. And your research in particular is, what I was hearing was that it's really looking at how it's impacted our identity and
Absolutely.
how it's shaped and formed our identity and our views. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So there's a wealth of research already that explores the process of how one assimilates. For example, if they're migrating to the United States or traditional European countries and adopting a Eurocentric worldview, right? When we talk about worldview, worldviews are those customs, those attitudes, and those beliefs that are, of course, determined by the culture that we typically identify with. One of the ways that individuals, and this is my perspective, have gone about coping with having to separate from one's own identity, one's own nationhood, their sense of origin, and being able to function in the dominant society is to completely rid themselves of their culture, of their beliefs, their attitudes, those values. And again, that may not necessarily be something that's done consciously. For many, it is. Others, it might be subconscious, to where they are repeatedly exposed to situations and events that either challenge or disrupt their traditional way of thinking, their attitudes, their beliefs. And they are then groomed to believe that that is not the correct way of being and of existing. And so we are programmed, essentially. I liken us very similar to computers, right? The mind becomes programmed as a result of these repeated experiences that we are subjected to over time, that will force us to either accommodate the dominant culture's ideology or to
Yeah.
simply assimilate into it. Accommodation is not something I find that happens with us often, where we're able to
Yeah.
maintain a sense of both our identity, who we are, our culture, and our heritage, and also adopting and incorporating what we would agree with from the dominant culture. Rather, we assimilate because we've been.
Looks like we're having some technical issues. Everyone. That's the nature of internet. You're back. You're
Yeah.
back. So if you can finish that last little part when you were talking about accommodation is not something that you see that we do.
Yeah, I think people are more likely to assimilate because we've been
Mhm.
conditioned and groomed to believe that the dominant culture is the right way, or as
Yeah.
the saying goes, the white way is the right way. And
Mhm.
that for us is a part of our trauma. It is a traumatizing experience to be stripped from what it is that you're familiar with, what it is that you have grown to believe is true, what it is that you've adopted in terms of your customs, your
Mhm.
language, your culture,
Right.
your
Right.
traditions, your values. All of those things are taken from you in order for you to be a part of another group or another entity, and then being told that that is the right way. So it
Yeah.
causes us to really question, in essence, what is right, what is wrong, and then we start to inherently see ourselves as what is wrong.
As what is wrong, I hear so many different areas that we can kind of migrate in with that. But one thing that the whole wrong piece, that everything that we do that could be is so damaging to our self-esteem, to who we
Absolutely.
are. And then I think sometimes the accommodation is something that we don't go for because it's assimilation seems to give this message of more safety, right? More of a
Hmm.
safety type of thing versus accommodation and survival, and so a lot of this came from us as a people once we were, in so much bondage here and stripped of so much.
Yeah.
Maintaining a certain amount of survival was important to us. So I think, I mean, it's just so many layers to that we could just go into, right? And then the other thing that I'm hearing, I do a lot of work around the superwoman syndrome, the Black superwoman syndrome, the schema,
Oh,
and
yes.
and we know the racial impacts that could come
Yes.
along with that, and also the pieces of trauma that can also relate to that, because trauma can strip away so much of our self-worth and our self-esteem that we find ourselves trying to prove ourselves, right?
Constantly.
Constantly. And then I also hear you, when I hear you speaking, I'm hearing post-traumatic slave syndrome, which many on our platform, Black Mental Health Matters, refer to as persistent
Yeah,
slave
it
syndrome.
is.
So did you want to go into any further into that piece?
Yeah, I would have to argue the same. I think when she's using the term post, it's referring to an era where there are no longer obvious indications of
Right.
enslavement, right? Where we have the lynchings or the hangings or, the separatism and
Yeah.
also being unequal. I think she's referring to an era where it was more overt.
Mm-hmm,
Right.
mm-hmm.
So I think when she uses the term post, that terminology is indicative of the racism and the discriminatory behavior is no longer as overt as it once was. However, it's still manifesting in a post-colonial time,
Yes.
and it's more covert. I would argue, though, that we are returning to more overt methods
Mm,
of slavery, of discrimination. It's manifesting in different ways. Our incarceration is one of those, I think, most obvious mechanisms that has been used. Modern day slavery, right? Mass incarceration, the reconditioning of our men mentally, the degradation that they're subjected to constantly, cruel and unusual punishment, capital punishment, all of those
mm-hmm,
things still meant to dehumanize, and to, I think, in some ways, deduce us to being nothing more than objects, still having to be controlled because
mm-hmm.
we're incapable of controlling ourselves. At least that is the
Yeah,
notion
that's the
that is
notion.
kind of spoken about, and that is kind of alluded to in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
these messages. And so what's interesting about today's time, and this is something I think for all of us to be aware of, we live in a time where you have to go beyond what is said and look into the depths of what is unspoken, because that's the
Yes,
essence of what
yes,
it is that's happening.
yes.
And unfortunately, we don't do enough of that. So we're never able to really deconstruct what exactly it is that we are experiencing. We're only looking at things from a surface level, and
Yeah.
that misses the depths of what it is that's actually occurring.
Yeah, and I see that a lot within our folk, our people, right? And
Yeah,
treatment. A lot of times you'll have this, this super hyper vigilance as to the racism, the discrimination, the separatists, and then I'll see this other end of the spectrum where it's almost like a denial, almost like a denial and trying to rationalize behaviors away from race when it's kind of obvious that it's a racial thing, and but they function in a space where they don't want to go there. They don't want to talk about race because they don't want they think that it's not like it used to be. And it kind of burns me because I understand. I definitely get the understanding that what we have endured has caused so much mental turmoil, and has really damaged us in multiple platitudes. We can't even go into
absolutely.
how much damage it has done to us as a people, and how we see ourselves and how we rear our children and how we just live our lives day to day.
Absolutely.
We don't even have enough time for it, right? So I understand that, but behaving in a manner that it does not exist, and not wanting to deal with what's under the surface is this. I feel like that's just as damaging.
Absolutely. And then I think that speaks to, though, those basic defense mechanisms, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Denial,
Yeah.
repression.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's projection,
Right. Right.
because
Right.
we're also projecting those things onto our children and other
Yeah.
individuals that are involved in our immediate intimate
Right.
space. So again, this is what happens when a mind is still enslaved, right? So
Yes.
they've moved beyond physical means. Right now, this is about programming and us being conditioned. And so
Yes.
we have to be unprogrammed. And the only way to do that is to unlearn and be unconditioned. Subjecting ourselves to experience that intentionally challenges these colonial beliefs that we have adopted and incorporated to be true. And the
Yeah.
reason that our people, I think, are so devout in holding on to those things is because in order for us to acknowledge that it's a possibility that they are stemming from slavery, remnants of
Yes.
slavery, among other experiences that we've had, it threatens our existence. It threatens what we know, what we've come to understand. It threatens
Hmm.
this truth that
Hmm.
we've been told that exists, right? And so all human beings, regardless of race, we avoid all things that could cause us pain and seek all things that cause pleasure, not
Hmm.
knowing that the things that may cause you temporary moments of pleasure will cause a lifetime of pain.
Right, and it deters the healing of trauma in general. When
Yeah,
you think about
absolutely.
trauma in
Absolutely.
general, so it just
Yeah,
heals. Avoidance is the number one cause of not healing. Right, that's one the number one
absolutely.
determinant. Right, so that background on trauma in general Amazing. I'm getting comments of how well said things were, your what you're speaking about, how well said you're putting the concepts. And so, we could go on for days about that, right? Let's look specifically, let's kind of just trying to change our gear specifically to sexual trauma, which again, trauma in general is trauma, right?
Absolutely.
And the healing process really looks the same across the board, right? But let's talk a little about sexual trauma within our community, within the Black diaspora, and some of the methods and things that we need to look at as not only clinicians, but as victims and survivors of trauma in healing process. So that's a lot. I know I gave you a whole lot. So let's start out. Let's start out small. Let's talk about the sexual trauma within our community.
Okay. So I know that sexual trauma is rampant in all communities. If you read the statistics, for example, like 1 in 10 males, for example, are likely to experience rape. Every 68 seconds, an individual is being sexually assaulted.
Yes.
We know that women are often the individuals who are more likely to experience sexual assault and sexual abuse. But I would argue that's due to just underreporting of males. And that is typically with men of color, because it threatens that masochism and that masochistic ideology that they have about what it is to be a man and about manhood, right? So there are those false narratives, hypermasculinity, I think, that play a significant role in reporting by men, but also in their idea about what constitutes rape, what constitutes consent.
Sexual abuse, that's right. Yep.
Yes, and then there are cultural factors. There are some cultural groups, minorities in particular, where it is common and tradition for them to engage in a sexual act as a young male with an adult female, and that is their initiation into manhood. So there are so many layers when we think about sexual abuse and trauma. We have to err on the side of caution of ensuring that we are not, again, and this is something I'm hypersensitive to. I'm a Black woman, but I also have Western ideology because that's the environment and the culture that I've been reared in.
Yeah.
So when you're approaching sexual abuse and trauma, your first order of business is identifying, yes, this is our working definition scientifically and clinically about trauma. How do these individuals define trauma in general?
Yeah. And that's important. That is definitely important. I have had several African-American males sit across from me in treatment and come to therapy because of hypersexuality, unable to maintain a healthy relationship, wanting to maintain a healthy relationship, but feeling that they have so many women out there, and to be limited to just one woman, they just don't have the attention span for it. So they come to therapy, and as we're talking, the first thing I do intake is one of the things I say, because I am a trauma therapist, right? One of the things I'll ask is any history of physical, sexual abuse, domestic violence, whatever. And I promise you, in all cases, these males that I have treated will say no. But
absolutely.
As we go on, right, they'll say, when I was 13, I had a girlfriend and she was 30. So I'm like, let's back that up,
Absolutely. But again, and I think this is very difficult for clinicians to hear, because they'll start questioning you in terms of your beliefs. What we're discussing right now is the intersection between cultural sensitivity and trauma.
Right.
You have to, as a clinician, assure that your ideas and your definitions are not infringing on how the individual has perceived their own experiences.
Yes.
You have to engage them in first defining what is trauma, because again, trauma is not necessarily something that exists in other cultural and other ethnic groups. For example, it is not uncommon, right, in certain parts of the world for there to be child marriages. Now, do we maybe as collective, as a society, believe that that's inappropriate? Absolutely. However, that is that particular culture's beliefs. Right. They have a structure. There's a system. For whatever reason, that has, perpetuated itself.
Right.
So your first order of business is becoming learned and educated about the culture.
Definitely. And then being able
the client that you're treating.
I agree. And then being able to, see the impacts of that, because he saw that as, now nobody else, it was a secret. So nobody else in the family in this particular situation
that is correct
knew about it, right?
That is correct.
But he saw that as a relationship, right?
Yes.
And so my job was to begin to look at the impacts of that, give him some idea, give him some psychoeducation on a 13-year-old's brain development versus a 30-year-old brain
That
development,
is correct.
and take him through the journey. Because you're right, if I would have just came right in and was like, that's sexual abuse, then he would have shut down, because in the beginning of treatment, he felt like that was a loving, nurturing relationship. Now, by the end
Yes.
of treatment, once I broke it down and stepped it and respected his values, he came out knowing that there was a power differential and he was taken advantage of.
And that's just it. Yeah, you absolutely have to do that. You have to assess culture in general, and then you have to see specifically that individual's perspective. See if the culture itself that needs to be researched, and that can mean many of things. That's race, that's gender,
Yeah.
and what's considered gender norms and gender roles in certain cultures.
Right.
You have to kind of understand demographics, what area they're from, even the time that an individual is born in and these things are occurring in, because that will give you an idea of what they might consider to be normal. And we have to be mindful of that terminology as well. Our norms and what's considered normal for us is affected by many different factors. And then assessing where the individual is on that continuum of what's normal and how they define sexual abuse and trauma will give you an idea about the appropriate clinical approach. So that's always your first order of business, is to become educated and learned. A lot of clinicians make the mistake of assuming that because they have the education that they then automatically know the correct way and means of going about treating the client. And your first priority is always to educate yourself. Education is something that has to be continuous, especially as we have, trauma itself that is continuing to evolve over time. And so the second order of business, after you've done that assessment with that individual, is to be attentive to and attuned to how they define those things, because you're likely to encounter resistance. Now, subconsciously, the individual may have awareness as they have aged that could have been sexual abuse or trauma. However, again, defense mechanisms are done in order to avoid any threat that challenges what they have believed all of this time. So even in the counseling relationship, there's a power differential. For example, a female that's counseling a male whose perpetrator was a female. So already there's a very similar dynamic, simply on the basis of A, you're a professional, B, you're a female, and C, if you're not cautious or aware, you might mimic those same behaviors that the perpetrator did, not consciously, obviously, but just in your language, your speech, your demeanor, and in your presentation. So the goal in counseling with victims of sexual trauma in particular is to shift the power differential. The individual has to perceive themselves as equal to you, despite the fact that you are, by content, of course, by degree, the expert, but they are the expert of their own narrative. And that is what is extremely important, especially in communities of color, because for quite a long period of time, power of our narrative and of our stories has been taken away. So you have to empower the individual and know that their narrative, their story, is what is going to carry the power in that relationship.
That's right. And for those who are listening that may not treat people with sexual trauma, but have experienced it and are looking to heal, these are things that you want to look at in your counselor. These are things that you want to look at in your therapist. And it's not your job as the person coming in for counseling to educate your counselor. That's not your job. And a lot of times counselors will say things like, well, I don't understand that. I don't understand that culture. No, but they need to find out. They need to find out. That is not your job to educate them. Your job is to come in and heal. And it's their job to do the work to know about you. And again, that calls the power differential. Because if I'm coming to therapy and let's say you're my counselor and let's say you're a white woman, right? And you're saying, you're coming to me, you don't know my culture. You're making cultural statements that are snafus. I feel re-victimized because see, you don't want to be in a position where you're being re-victimized. And as a counselor, as a therapist, we don't want to be in a position where we are unknowingly re-victimizing,
perpetuating that cycle.
Right? Exactly. Yeah. And so these are important things to look for in your therapist.
Yeah. And to your point, speaking of ethics, because this is always a perfect opportunity to discuss ethics. To say that you're not competent in a particular culture, particular group, or particular subject area does not warrant you to make a referral either. You are obligated as a counselor to exhaust all options and means of becoming educated and learned about a particular population, because you have an ethical duty to still serve them. and
That's
to
right.
uphold our ethical principles and our ethical mandates.
Yes.
Justice, fidelity,
Yes.
integrity, you know, non-malfeasance, beneficence. Those are the very pillars that we have to stand upon. And so to say you're not educated, we'll never be 100% educated on any particular cultural or ethnic group, for example, or any particular subject area. It's your responsibility to constantly be in a state of willing to learn as you are of being the expert. And so
Right.
again, that goes back to you making a conscious effort of shifting the power differential. One of the ways of doing so, and this is not an intervention, this is simply a way of being, right? And I think this speaks to humility, which is something that a lot of counselors lack and you need to have,
Yeah.
especially when you're treating victims of trauma. You need to acknowledge to the client, this may not be something I'm familiar with. I'm not educated about your culture. That then gives the client the opportunity for you to ask questions, to become educated, to express interest, to have a desire to learn about those experiences. And what that does is, again, that shifts the power differential. It
Yes. I
places
was
the
gonna say
client
that.
in the seat of being in control.
Yes.
Why is that important? Because with victims of sexual abuse and trauma of any kind, control is what has been removed.
Yep.
Power is what has been removed and what has been taken, right? By nature of the fact that you have another individual, typically an authority figure, who's in
Mhm.
a position that will mute the individual, silence the individual. Oftentimes there are threats, there are coercements. There's this
Mhm.
false ideology that there's something unique or special about them, which is why
Mhm.
they've been chosen to be
Yeah.
perpetrated upon. And so you have to make a conscious effort in order to simultaneously in your session is essentially what we like to call in vivo exposure. It's
Yeah.
gradually putting your client in a position of unlearning those particular thoughts that they have had that reinforce, number one, the victimization and the likelihood of them being re-victimized if they maintain those beliefs. So it
Mhm.
is an absolute necessity that by all means in your sessions, you put your client in a position of being the one to take lead in those sessions and
Yeah.
to occupy that seat of control.
Excellent. Yeah, I completely agree because, like you said, no matter what you do, there's always going to be a slight power differential that they're aware
Absolutely.
of, and so it's our job to always try to level out the playing ground and say and make those statements, make those humbling statements like, yes, I may have the degree, I may be the expert in this particular field, considered the expert, but you're the expert on your life. You're
Absolutely.
you're the expert on you. You're the expert on what happened in these circumstances, and so that and treating sexual trauma is not easy, but it requires work. And one of the things that I share with my clients is that as therapists, we have our own pieces of trauma, especially women of color, especially Black women. We Black people, we have our
Absolutely.
own trauma, right? But what can help us be excellent therapists is not necessarily that we have that trauma, but that we've done the healing ourselves. Because a lot
Correct.
of times with the sexual trauma, if you have not done the work and you've been exposed to that as a therapist, that could hinder so much of the treatment, and cause the power differential to be even greater. Sometimes push the treatment along faster than what it should be because it
Absolutely.
is the journey
Absolutely.
of the client. Now we're not perfect. We make our own mistakes and we bring our own baggage to therapy as well. But these are things that not you as the client who's looking for treatment need to look for, but as well as the practitioner with internally, what are some of the things that I need to be looking at for myself to show up as my best version of myself to treat those that I serve.
Yeah. And what you're speaking to is same race, I think, and
Yes.
sameness in counseling relationships, right? Another area where there should be a lot of research on is how do we respond to individuals that look like us, that
Yes.
have
Yes.
similar or shared experiences? Because even in that moment, despite the fact that you have a degree and you have the education, there's a sense of sameness and connection that may not exist
Hmm.
with an individual that is
Hmm.
outside that racial or
Hmm.
that ethnic group.
Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
one of the things that I've become hyper aware of in my sessions is we, by nature of our race, our ethnicity, our culture, have very similar or shared experiences. So I'm acutely aware when those old attitudes and beliefs that maybe I used to
Hmm.
have or that
Hmm.
I'm continuing to work through might start to manifest in my
Hmm.
sessions. Here's a
Hmm.
prime example. A client can be disclosing sexual abuse and trauma, and then that old school saying of, oh, What happens in our house stays in our house. That's your
Mm-hmm.
subconscious speaking to you, because
Mm-hmm.
that's what we have been taught in our families,
Mm-hmm.
especially
Mm-hmm.
families of color and in Black families. So you're sitting across from a client and there's discomfort because they're disclosing what they've experienced, which defies, right? It
Mm-hmm.
defies the instructions that we have been given since children about whatever is
Mm-hmm.
happening in the home is to remain in the home. If you're
Mm-hmm.
not aware of that consciously, and you don't make a conscious effort to even dispute your own thought that moment, in that moment as the
Mm-hmm.
clinician, you're
Mm-hmm.
going to make the error of again perpetuating that cycle of abuse by
Yeah.
silencing your client, not
Mm-hmm.
because of them, but out of your own discomfort. So there
Yes.
is sometimes
Yes.
in these situations something we have to speak to in terms of trauma and abuse with same relationships. And when I mean same relationships, I'm referring to shared culture, whether that's on the basis of race, it could be on the basis of religion, whatever it is that unifies us and that we have a similarity on. We have to also talk about transference and countertransference, because we
Yes.
cannot remove those from the conversation. If you're not cognizant of that, you cannot introduce that into the session where it could be beneficial and used in a clinically appropriate manner to
Mm-hmm.
even help the client combat and challenge some of those same attitudes and beliefs. As
Yes.
African Americans, we more than likely have been told that. So
Yeah.
if I have that subconsciously occur, and that's what I'm hearing, it would be ideal for me to introduce tell me about what were some of the things you were told about what happens in your house.
Yeah.
How are
Yeah.
you told to deal with things that happen in your house? Because what I'm getting into is, what are the attitudes and beliefs that you have held devoutly to that even in present time affect you and are perpetuating the cycle of abuse? And I don't mean sexually at this point, I mean emotionally and
Mm-hmm.
mentally, because
Mm-hmm.
those are the continued consequences of what they've gone through from umpteenth years ago. So we
Yeah.
have to go deeper in figuring out how are we also simultaneously, because of our beliefs, perpetuating our own abuse
Yes.
after we've
Yes.
been
Yes.
perpetrated upon.
Yes. 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 And I don't know that, and we can go into, again, plethora of levels of conversation topics in terms of perpetuating our own abuse, because oftentimes what you'll see when folks have not yet started the healing process is
Mm-hmm.
dating people that's similar to their perpetrators,
Oh, yes.
recreating those dynamics, those abusive
Yes.
dynamics, or
Yes.
allowing those abusive dynamics to re-enter into their spaces,
Mm-hmm.
finding themselves attracted to similar abusive type of people, and wondering
Yeah.
why, what was happening here. He's a lot like my perpetrator, and sometimes they don't even recognize it until they come to treatment, and they're
Yeah.
sitting in treatment. They're telling you about their paramour, and it doesn't even have to be a romantic relationship. It could be a friendship. It could be a work
Family
situation,
relationships.
family relationship,
Yeah.
and it
Any
looks
kind.
just like the abuse, and it's our job to help them see that. Speaking of
Mm-hmm.
which, if we have some viewers that are listening that may be looking to heal from trauma, in addition to therapy, right? What would you recommend that they could do? Some things that they can do. Well, what can we recommend? But let's start with you. that they can do, or begin to do, implement within their own personal spaces, outside of therapy, to facilitate the healing process.
I think the first and most important thing is to establish boundaries and to
Mm,
learn what
yes,
boundaries are.
yes,
Because
yes,
before
yes.
you even start the healing process, if you don't set strict boundaries and expectations that are realistic with where you are and with what you're capable of, where you are and what you're capable of, a lot of us try to set boundaries and expectations for where we aspire to be or who we aspire to be, instead of taking into account where are we in the present moment, right?
Hmm.
Then we set
Hmm.
ourselves up for failure. And
Yeah.
so that is something that when you are a person, especially who's been victimized, and I say the word victimized because I'm still thinking back to even what we talked about in the beginning of the session. We
Hmm.
as marginalized people have many depths and layers of trauma. Sexual
Hmm.
abuse is one of many that occurred in slavery, the
Hmm.
emotional abuse, the mental abuse, and the turmoil,
Hmm.
right? And so we have to think about, again, kind of setting and maintaining boundaries. You have to create a space and be intentional about creating a space that will allow you the opportunity to heal.
That's right. And people do, and boundaries are the very first thing that goes when you are sexually traumatized,
Absolutely.
because
You've
your
been
body no longer
violated.
Your body's no longer yours. You don't,
Absolutely.
it was just a free fall for whoever the perpetrator was, right? And because of that, oftentimes what happens is that without those strong boundaries, we start to other perpetrators become attracted. It's not we're attracting them. Perpetrators are attracted to the boundaryless type of
The
person,
vulnerability.
the
Yeah,
vulnerability
absolutely.
and the poor boundaries, and therefore you find yourself being re-victimized again. So boundaries are extremely important. I'm glad you went there first because that was on my top of my list. That is extremely
Yeah.
important.
And I can say that, and I can share this in all transparency. I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and it was something that occurred within my family. And so as I aged, I started being more cognizant. I've always been, I think, an intellectual in terms of evaluating my decisions, what it is I gravitated towards, what it is that was attracted to me. Not that I was attracted to those individuals, but
Yes.
that vulnerability, the lack of understanding that despite the fact I've been violated, that my body still belonged to me.
Yes. It's mine.
Despite being
I have a right
violated,
over my
it
body.
was
Yep.
still
Still
mine,
mine.
right?
Yep.
Understanding my right to myself, right? Ownership and
Yes.
reclaiming my body.
Yes.
And so what happened is that one incident manifested into another, and then another, and then that cycle itself continues to repeat
Yes.
itself, right? And so what's happening is that you have one of three things that can typically happen. And again, this is my perspective. As a result, individuals either become just non-physical, where they don't desire sex or intimacy because
Yeah.
of those
Yeah.
violations.
Yeah.
They can become hypersexual, obviously, because they've been groomed and understand that they have to lead with the body first, because the body
Yes.
is something that they don't
Yes.
have control over, right?
Yes.
But it's
Yep.
what's desirable. Or individuals who are maybe hyposexual, they're sexually engaged and active, but the performance, the libido, all of those things may be less. So sexual trauma can manifest itself in many different ways. I recognized at a very early age that because of my experiences, I became my own perpetrator and my own pimp. And so we have to be mindful. Again, this goes back to boundaries. I was seeking something because of this idea that there was a void that needed to be filled.
Yeah.
Because again, the void that needed to be filled was a sense of power. And so in a young, malleable mind, especially for children, my thought was the way of reclaiming that power is to be the one in charge of and exploiting self. If it's going to occur, I need to be the one in control of those situations or of those incidents. And again, there are long-term ramifications. There are long-term consequences for that, psychologically and also mentally. So in addition to there being boundaries and being boundaries specific to your physical space, access to your emotions, right? Access to what occurs with you mentally. The second is to really redefine how you perceive relationships.
And sex.
What is a
Right.
relationship?
And how do you
Understanding that
perceive
there are
sex as
different
well?
types.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And I heard what you were saying about the hyper, and then
Yes.
non-sexual, right? I see that a lot. There's either, most of the clients I see tend to be hypersexual, but then once in a
Absolutely.
caring relationship, they become, they become, for some reason, sex is no longer appealing to them. Now,
Yes.
outside of the caring and nurturing,
Yes.
that they were hypersexual, they were sleeping around, and then they find someone that genuinely cares about them, not just their body, and for some reason that's not attractive to them anymore, right?
And you
so
just
you're
said
right.
it. It's because it's mutual.
Yes,
They're
it's
not
mutual.
accustomed to being in a situation where the desire is mutual, where they have choice. They're accustomed to there always being a power differential where one or the
Yes.
other is in control. So that
Yes.
speaks to this false sense of, I think a false idea of what it means to be equal, right?
Yes.
So that, I think, is what's happening. The fact of the matter is they're only deriving pleasure from a maladaptive pattern of understanding that sex can only occur when one individual is in control.
Yep.
And again, that is the perpetuation of that cycle. That
The
is those
cycle.
long-term consequences and those
Right.
ramifications that
And
you're
being
going to
able to
witness and you're going to
dismantle it is
experience.
important. Being able to dismantle it is important. And
Yes.
how do you use sex? One of the things I would encourage anyone who survived sexual trauma is, how do you view sex? Because some see it as a comfort, in terms of a comfort, not a way to display love, but as a comfort when they're anxious, as a comfort when they feel
Yes,
lonely.
ma'am.
And then and without doing any work behind that relationship. So they're, again, in and out of relationships, sleeping around, and the consequences of those types of things
Yeah.
can be dangerous, right? Can be very dangerous. We have a someone in the comments thanking you for your vulnerability and your transparency. And I too want to thank you for sharing your story as well. We appreciate that. The one thing I want to add in terms of what you're talking about to our viewers is part of the healing process of sexual trauma outside of therapy is having those good boundaries. I'm so glad Doc brought that up because that's number one. And that's
Yes,
one of
it
the
is. That's
biggest
the
things you're going
priority.
to find yourself struggling with is boundaries because they were all blurred. They were just
Yep.
all blurred,
Yep.
not knowing where my body stopped and somebody else's body began and all those types of things play a
Absolutely.
big part. But the other thing I want folks to understand is you have to have a good support system. And when I say a good support system, people that have earned a right to hear your story, because I find a lot of my clients that have survived sexual trauma have the worst support systems. And they'll say, this is my best friend. This is the person that I genuinely care about. And the person is perpetuating abusive cycles within their lives, taking advantage of them, violating all types of boundaries, whether it's with money, space, other relationships, sharing their personal information. And I work with my client, like, is that really a friend? Let's define what a friend is and what makes you think this person is a friend. Because what I'm hearing is a perpetuation of some of those.
And I appreciate you for
patterns.
saying that. Again, we have to be mindful. The relationships that they're identifying that are their most supported is coming from a place that they're accustomed to being in the role of being a victim.
Yes.
We have
awesome.
to talk about that. They
Powerful.
are accustomed to being in the role of a victim. So again, this goes back to understanding what is normal for them.
Yes.
You and I both know, Dr.
Yes.
Don, that is not a fruitful relationship
At all.
right?
At all.
We understand that. But I can even say this again based on personal experience. Whenever I was in an equal relationship, for me, that is the relationship that was unhealthy. Why? Because I had been conditioned to believe that my norm is what was healthy. Those are those maladaptive thinking patterns and those maladaptive behaviors that manifest over time. So what we first have to do is define what is a relationship for them. Because if they lead with sex being the relationship, that again reinforces the fact that we have more work to do clinically around the trauma itself and around the abuse. The second thing is helping them to define what are all the different types of relationships that exist. There are 4 to 5 different types of supports that we can have from people. Emotional support, mental, it can be financial, monetary, it can just be pure social. We have to help them define what are all the different types of supports that exist. And third, and most importantly, every person that's involved in your support system is not going to give you every last one of those supports. You need to decide what type of support is this person capable of giving, and 2, what are they willing to give? Because the issue is they might not be willing.
And based off the evidence, not based off what you want them to be.
Yeah, what have they done tangibly that you can justify?
Because we can have this idea.
This is what I know and see that you're capable of doing. Because a lot of times what we do, and this goes back into, I think, that power and control differential used to being the victim. We will find ways of justifying based on our ideas. And this, again, why I said capable versus able and willing. They're capable of doing whatever it is that they choose to do, but are they willing to? And if they're unwilling, you need to reevaluate whether or not that individual is who is in your best interest.
And have they demonstrated that in the past? Because a lot of times I'll have, again, in treating sexual trauma, and we're talking about supports because I work on things like these are things you have to do outside a session.
Absolutely.
You may see me once or twice a week, but that's only 1 or 2 hours versus all the hours. I forget how many hours we have in a week, right? And
Too many.
The healing process, right? The healing process only sticks if you do the work outside of session as well, right?
Repetition and consistency.
Exactly. And so I work on the boundaries. I work on redefining not just romantic relationships, but also just, supportive relationships. I often get clients that will say, I went to, let's say, my mom, and I shared something that I was going through with my mom, and she was absolutely awful in handling it. And again, throughout the session, I work with them to say, what was the evidence that you had that made you think that it was going to be any different? How you have presented your mom over the last several weeks has been pretty consistent with how she responded to you in this particular incident. And so sometimes what happens is that people show us, especially with sexual trauma, people show us who they are, but we have on these glasses, these rose-colored glasses, put them in this box and make them be what we think they should be. And you know what? maybe they should be that person, but
Yeah.
not. And when we are constantly setting ourselves up for failure, going to these people, expecting them to be something that they're not, we ourselves are perpetuating that trauma.
Same cycle. And again, it's unfortunate. You know, one of the things I work with my clients on, and I talk to them about this often, is there are three parts of self, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's the ideal self, which is your highest aspiration if all were perfect in a perfect world, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's the perceived self, who it is that you aspire to be, how others perceive you based on what they're experiencing. And then somewhere in the middle is the real you and the real experience, right? And so we have to stay in what's real and what's tangible, because again, aspirations do no justice in your trauma work. We're talking about future tense. That's not our priority. Our priority is focused on what's happening in the here and now and staying in the present moment. And I think people that have experienced trauma, and again, this comes back to a place of being victimized, sometimes they will create a fantasy of their own that allows them to function on a day-to-day basis, right?
Yes,
because it's less threatening, right?
Yes.
And so we see that even with children, when they've experienced sexual trauma or abuse, we call it dissociation in clinical terms, but they revert back to a place of solitude, you know, that's of refuge. Adults will do the very same by avoiding evidence that contradicts what they think. And again, that itself can prevent the change process. Once you progress in your therapeutic relationship, being able to engage in gentle confrontation is going to be an absolute necessity, because it allows the client to be exposed to attitudes and beliefs that may contradict what they have considered and come to believe is norms and normative behavior, because your goal is to evoke the change process. Now, I will say that try as we might, people are motivated to change, but they're also motivated to stay the same. And so that is, for a lot of clinicians, is uncomfortable to talk about. But motivational interviewing, in terms of not the trauma itself, but in terms of relationships and making changes in relationships, is going to be key. It's neutral, it's non-confrontational. It's something, again, that puts the client in a position of power and authority to make decisions and to explore and process what's beneficial and what's practical, and you can evaluate where they stand on being able to make those decisions. When a person's been traumatized to this extent, this is not work that's done overnight. You're going to have to do work on abandonment. That's something we could talk about another day, because we know how that goes. You're going to have to do some work on abandonment. You're going to have to do some work on codependency.
Self-worth, because self-worth and codependency go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
Because now I'm looking
You're
to
going to have to do maybe some counseling specific to family dynamics and family systems. Because again, especially in our families, these things are generational. It happened to your great grandmother, it happened to your grandmother, then it happened to your mother, then it happened to you. And I can say, even in my family, that it wasn't up until probably about 2 to 3 years ago that I heard that it had happened with both of my mother's cousins. Wow. And then even prior to that, the women that were in the family, those stories were never shared with us as children.
But that's the power. But that's the power of the secret.
That's power.
Yeah. That's the power of the secret. That's how trauma perpetuates.
That's how it
is. Nobody's talking. Nobody's talking about. They're talking, but not about what we need to be talking about.
But it goes back to that saying, right? What happens in my house
stays in my house. But we're not even talking to each other in the house.
Yes.
You know, we're not even talking to each other in the house. So it happened in the house, but I'm not even telling my sister that it happened so she can be careful. I'm not telling anyone. And so it's happening over and over and over.
But they don't think that way. You know, a part of what's happening, and I remember this when it was my experience, I automatically felt an impulse to protect the perpetrator. Right? Because I started rationalizing in my mind, even as a young child, what could he have experienced that possibly caused him to do that to me? Right? And so that is, again, a child's mind of trying to make sense out of a senseless situation. Those are defense mechanisms. Adults kind of perpetuate those same cycles. In their mind, they're doing justice by not providing that information so as not to incite fear, perhaps, not to incite conflict. There are many reasons of that, right? But they're thinking with their logical mind, and what happens is that emotionally they're left in turmoil and in chaos. So there are many layers, again, of this work that have to be done. But your priority is always going to be boundaries, and that includes setting boundaries and expectations in the therapeutic relationship. You as a therapist, your relationship with that client is their first introduction of appropriate and healthy boundaries. And you could simultaneously model a healthy working relationship in therapy. That is why the interventions matter less than the day-to-day interaction that you're having with your client. That is their exposure of what it is that you hope that they'll be able to create once they have successfully completed their journey.
That is, and again, that's phenomenal because all these pieces are interchangeable, and that's what I think we want listeners to hear is that healing sexual trauma doesn't happen overnight. And,
No.
Do everyone who's been sexually traumatized need therapy? No, but a lot of us do. And especially Black folk, we will not go and get
Yes.
that help because of what stays in the house, what happens in the house stays in the house. Plus, there's been so many cultural dynamics that would keep us from not reaching out and getting the appropriate help. Then we don't have enough representation. It's not enough people of
Absolutely.
color, enough African Americans out there to treat us. And that sameness can really help a lot with the healing process because we have similar experiences. And I don't have to explain to you a lot of this because you have lived it. Even if I don't know you and you lived across the world, you have a very similar experience to mine. And so these, we need you to understand that it takes work to heal. It's very beneficial because you get to, not only do you break the cycle within yourself, but also within the family's dynamic as well, because
absolutely
will see you healing, the children will see you healing, the boundaries will be put in place. So it's complicated. It takes steps. Not only are you going to therapy, but like she said, we have the boundary pieces. I was pointing out the supportive relationships. How do you view sex? These are things you could do on your own. Journaling is a really good way to pull all of this
yes,
in.
cathartic at its best.
Brain dump, just getting it out on paper, being able to, what we're telling you in this particular broadcast, you could actually write these things out and start to look at these things. Doing that work outside a session or before you look for treatment is crucial. It's not going to all happen in the therapy room. A lot of it will, but it's not all going to happen in there. Yes.
I absolutely agree.
And someone pointed out shame and guilt. And we're talking about shame and guilt. Someone else pointed out abandonment. They said abandonment is a big one, like you pointed out. Yes. And we're talking about African American, Black people across the diaspora. I use African American a lot because I'm in the United States, but we're talking about Black people throughout the diaspora. Someone asked, a gentleman in the chat who will remain nameless said, Black women don't care anything about relationship. All they want is money. I think that speaks to what you were talking about, those mindsets that we bring that have been put into us by colonization. Right. And so here we have this person who is talking about Black women as a whole, and it's generalizing, right? Yeah. So you're doing the very thing that the colonizer or the colonization has perpetuated upon us across the world. We're doing it to one another, and that's important not to do, right?
Yeah. Again, I think at any given time with us in particular, we have a long way to go.
That's right. Yeah.
We've become the very thing that we work so tirelessly to remove ourselves from.
Exactly. But again, I feel like it was part of the insidious plan of colonization.
It is.
It was part of that plan to, not only are we going to enslave them physically, but mentally. And then we're going to plant these seeds that once they're no longer in physical chains, they're going to perpetuate some cycles. So that, that's going to help it be easier for us to remain in the supremacist place that we think we're supposed to be as white colonizers.
Yep. Well, a good rule of thumb. Read the Jim Crow laws.
Yes.
And that will tell you and explain just how that conditioning began. Absolutely.
Yes. So we're about to wrap up. Like I said, we had someone bring up the abandonment pieces that we touched on. I had someone talked about when you need to value your partner and connect with your partner, which can be really difficult to do with sexual trauma because you may think that you're connecting with your partner, but there's some things that may be happening out that's projecting through the trauma is projecting through the relationship.
There's a difference in sex and intimacy. And so if you are receiving treatment or considering receiving treatment, one of the things that need to be discussed and hopefully will be discussed by your counselor is sex versus intimacy. Sex is one way of being intimate with an individual, but intimacy requires some level of mental and emotional connection with an individual. And so again, those are things when you've been violated or abused, you might not have a thorough understanding of, right? Or having had representation in order for you to understand those things. So being able to distinguish the two is key.
That's true. That's very true. And that's very important. So as we wrap up, did you have any other pieces that you wanted to recommend that could be done outside of the treatment pieces? I really appreciate how we went into in depth your expertise in terms of the clinician pieces, because it's important for our viewers that are looking for services and treatment to understand these are the things that I should be looking for from my therapist. And it's okay, right? To come in with those questions and come in with those expectations and having that dialogue. I know as a therapist, I appreciate it because it gives me an opportunity and just with what the client is saying, to gain a lot of insight into how the client is thinking, but also to check myself to make sure I am able to provide those pieces. And if I'm not, going back to the table and doing that work. Did you want to add anything else that they can be doing outside of the actual therapy office in terms of the healing pieces?
My recommendation would be a support group with fellow men or women. And I quite frankly would recommend a space that allows for both male and female, because you need to be able to identify other perspectives, and that will help you to reframe and reshape how you see individuals of the opposite sex. If you've been perpetrated on by an individual of the opposite sex or even the same sex, support groups are a valuable intervention, because in that case, every individual in that room is equal. There is no quote unquote therapist, right? And so again, that goes back to the power and control differential. Everyone in that space is equal, has equal leverage, equal power, equal authority in essence. And that is necessary for facilitating a therapeutic environment and therapeutic group. So I would recommend, once a person has progressed in their treatment, to participate in a support group. Very different than a counseling group, because again, it's not counseling led, but that is an opportunity for collaboration with survivors, right? And that will then help to kind of strengthen those relationships, because you need a network of support, and that goes beyond individuals in your family or your immediate circle. And that would be something I would highly recommend.
I just got a comment that's so powerful, and this is so true. And thank you for bringing this up. A lot of countries, there's no therapy. There are no
Not
therapies
for long.
Not yet, not for long. We're working on it, right? Yeah, we're working on it, right? That's one of the reasons why Black Mental Health Matters platform exists. But that's a very good point. And that is exactly why in those countries that do not have therapy, that we're talking about things that you can do outside of the office, in terms of the journaling, in terms of getting that support system, in terms of working on boundaries and those types of things, because we are understanding and do realize that there are some places that do not have treatment, and it burdens our heart and it hurts our heart. One of the reasons why this platform does exist. And last but not least, before we go, this last comment I can ask you, the body keeps score. That's a whole nother hour, right? We're going to a whole nother hour about the body keeping score and how helping others understand that process. So in a nutshell, with a little bit of time that we have left, tell me, can you give them something about how the body keeps score? I mean, I don't think I can. I don't think I
would say that in essence, if I could sum that up, your body is your first keeper of trauma, right? So that goes back to brain development. The hippocampus is what maintains those memories. And our body also operates based on association. If you've had a negative or a traumatic experience, something similar occurs, it's going to elicit the same physiological and emotional response as if the traumatic event is happening. Again, all the more reason why that exposure therapy is going to be essential for you, so that you can recondition your mind to have different associations and pairings. Right. And then you're not as hypersensitive or overly responsive to stimuli that might not be seen as harmful. One of the challenges with trauma is that we might often start perceiving all things as having the propensity to cause harm, even when they do not, right? Because we're starting to generalize based on those traumatic experiences. So that's specifically what it's referring to. Your body is your first keeper of all secrets. Yep. And so I would say, I would definitely say that in closure, in terms of why, again, exposure therapy, trauma-specific treatment is going to be absolutely imperative. And in reference to the comment about the countries that do not have mental health care treatment, I'm very sure that in the very near future that is about to change, especially in our African, Caribbean countries. A goal of myself, and I've heard many other Black clinicians, is that peace is not something that should have to cost. That's right. Therefore, we have an obligation and duty to our people to ensure they have access to these services. And so I do foresee in the near future that will become a thing. So stay encouraged. I really appreciate this platform. It's been a wonderful opportunity, Dr. Don, to be with here, to be here with you today and all of the viewers.
Yes, and I'm looking forward to us doing this again, because we have so much more we could talk about.
We do.
we have so much more we can vibe on, you know. So
Me
I
too.
appreciate you. This has been phenomenal. Everyone in the comments that had anything relating to sexual trauma, thank you so much for taking time to put the comments in. Thank you so much for taking time to sit with us this early morning. For us, it's early. I don't know where you know, we're all over the world, so I don't know what time it is in the rest of the world, but it's early for us. But we appreciate everybody's comments and taking time to be a part of us this morning. Have a wonderful rest of the day and feel better. We thank you. I know you wasn't feeling your best.
Thank you.
I will be reaching out to you so that we can look into doing some more things together in the near future.
Okay, thank you so much. You all have a
You're
wonderful
welcome.
day.
Bye. Bye. Everybody have a good one.